What's that? Who there? Whoa.
All right, guys, I've got Leo Wang, the founder and CEO of Buffy here. Leo, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm stoked to do this. Thanks again for coming on. So what I like to do is just dive right into, your personal background. Before we get into the company, I'd like to get, behind the mind of the founder that we're talking to. And so you've had an interesting set of experiences. You were a speechwriter, management consultant at McKinsey. You interned at the Clinton Foundation, which is a really, really incredible background. So I'd love if you could just start out, take us through a quick snapshot of your journey leading up to when you started thinking about Buffy.
Sure. I was actually thinking about this last night and not sleeping, but it's kind of weird. I feel like everything happened to me in a really chaotic or less than intentional way. So originally I was born in China, just starting from the beginning, and we'll actually come back to that. But originally I was born in China. I moved to the US when I was about 6 years old. And my parents were entrepreneurs, and they had their own business. They worked on it almost constantly. And I think that was just the backdrop of my life and really made it kind of clear that this is something that I could do too and try my hand at. And maybe I was even expected to do when I grew up. I went to college, studied finance, and then after that, I actually went to graduate school where I did that speech writing, where I had that speech writing role. And then going to McKinsey was actually a close friend, just kind of almost led me through the process and coached me and guided me through it. I think they originally were kind of a project manager there. They knew me and thought that I would be a good fit. And so funnily enough, I feel like that was largely a relationship driven opportunity or decision. It's a really kind of grueling process that is, I feel like, also archaic in many ways. It's not very clear. And I think having someone to walk you through it is one of probably the only ways that you can actually get through it. So, then I think working on Buffy was really just triggered by my family background. As I mentioned earlier, my parents were entrepreneurs. My dad had basically been in the bedding world in one form or another for about 30 years now. And we had already started to own and operate our own family-owned weaving mill, and had made bedding for a number of kind of big home brands, retailers like Bed Bath & Beyond, etc. here in the US. So I guess, long story short, what I'm trying to say is a couple of those big experiences really came from the people around me and family, and it's strange how life can go that way, I guess.
Yeah. I'm wondering, so you had this experience early on with a family and entrepreneurship, and did you ever think in the back of your mind, like, I'm eventually going to join the family business in the bedding industry at all? Or, like many kids of entrepreneurial families, they often start out the opposite. Like, I don't want to touch this. I don't want to be in the family business. What was your mentality? And obviously we know that you came back around to the industry.
Yeah, honestly, that's a great question because I was not interested. I think it was just too mundane, just being kind of the air that you're breathing or the water that you're swimming in. You just don't even see it or recognize it. Or I think for a long time I felt that way about it. And I worked at McKinsey on some totally different things. I was in economic development mostly, working on education and infrastructure and healthcare, anywhere between like Ethiopia to Pakistan. And for the longest time, even after that, I did some kind of social entrepreneurship startups before I came to Buffy. Things like, actually, we created this platform that's somewhat like Uber, but not just for drivers, also for maids or cooks or nannies in India. Actually, it was based in Mumbai. There's a lot of low-skilled labor there that don't have essentially skills or wage ladders to climb up to find means to make more and more, right? And this was kind of a platform that tried to enable them to do so. Just as an example, it wasn't until I had just tried so many things, learned a lot, but ultimately failed at so many things that I think the fog was almost kind of just pulled from my eyes. And I was like, wait a minute, I have this incredible competitive advantage or asset underneath my nose and a lot more knowledge now that 5-10 years of just kind of business world or entrepreneurship experience has taught me, has equipped me to do with it. And I think it was only until then, I was already 27 or 28, when I realized, wow, I do want to do something like this.
Yeah. It's a great point about kind of that unfair advantage. You had that, no one else in the world had that huge foundation of the betting background, knowledge, family background. And I think that's critical. Something I want to press into as we keep going. Before we get into Buffy though, I have to ask about the speech writing experience, because I think you never see people with that background. And so I'd love to hear from you when you think about that experience, what are some of the things that persist in the best speeches, or the best speech writers, use these types of tactics? I think it would be really, really interesting for people to hear.
Wow. I'm going to try and find an answer for you by just reacting. I think, well, first of all, I think communication in general has been like a big theme in my life. And I think in the skill set or toolkit of many consumer entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs in general, forever. And I think especially in the last 5-10 years with the onset of the D2C kind of transformation from e-commerce. What I really mean by that is your ability to articulate something differently, compellingly, clearly, succinctly, et cetera, is so much of what distinguishes either someone with just a great idea and someone who can execute it and really market it and bring it to market well. That's just a very high level kind of principle or thought, right? But when I think about it, that speech writing gig and then working at McKinsey as a management consultant, you're really, I think, just a kind of overblown communication specialist. You are basically there hired to frame things, to communicate things in as compelling a way as possible. I think led me to think about betting in a way of like, how can we change the story? How can we shift, for example, the value premises that are being communicated here by the brand or the language it uses, the color, the graphics, et cetera, right? I don't know, as far as it goes for actual tactical things, I think in the context of entrepreneurship, it's really just fundamentals like being as concise as possible. You don't realize, it's almost like getting a tattoo. Let's take an example, right? Like you're getting a tattoo, you're not going to want like to write an essay on your arm, right? You want it to be as succinct and concise as possible. This really big idea that you've maybe thought about or dreamt about or like turned and tossed at night about, that you could really write pages about, maybe you have whittled down, worked out into a statement or a phrase or even just a single word that evokes all of that meaning for you, right? The ability and the instinct for someone to just want to continue grinding an idea or a statement or a phrase into something that really sticks, you really can't overlook the power of something like that, right? I think about, all the D2C examples. The one that comes to mind right now is like the Allbirds one, where I think originally their tagline was "turns out the most comfortable shoes made out of wool," or something like that. I might not have it 100%, but it's just so simple and gets the entire concept and brand. And if you don't understand anything, we live in a very kind of fragmented attention world. If you can just take that away, you've taken everything you need to take away. Right? I think succinctness, clarity is just two things that people can always work at. It's something that I'm still working on.
Yeah. I think, to that point, copywriting is such a superpower. And that's, verbal communication, written communication, the threads of your brand. That's what interfaces with consumers, the way you tell the story and the way you craft the message. So I couldn't agree more. So as we shift to the Buffy story, so I think it's really interesting when I think about your background and then how you came to tackle this space. One thing I love asking founders is the way they assess the market opportunity. So typically people will say, I looked at the space and there were one or multiple insights or unmet needs that I saw that the majority of either entrepreneurs tackling this space or really even consumers had. And so for you, because you had all that family background and knowledge share around the industry, I'm sure you had deeper insight than most. But when you thought about positioning Buffy and tackling the space the way you did, what was that unmet need or that secret insight that you guys had?
I think the secret insight, just building off what we were already talking about, was just that bedding products and brands communicate poorly. And there's a lot at Buffy that we try to do. Stepping back, there's a lot at Buffy that we try to do around innovating in terms of product or manufacturing, around particularly sustainability, but also comfort, use of materials, etc. But what really drew me into the opportunity originally was just how inarticulate bedding brands are, particularly on where 80% of it's sold, which is on the shelves of a place like Bed Bath & Beyond, right? It is extremely difficult to distinguish one bedding brand from another, one product from another. The colors being used are almost all the same. The fonts, even the terminology, wording have a lot of overlap. And then I think the functional promises are not very clear. Is it supposed to make me sleep better, or is it just more firm and supportive? What is it? And then I think most importantly, bedding products are still and have mostly always been sold as a commodity, which is different. A commodity is very different than a product. And what I mean by that is, look, at the end of the day, Nike sells polyester shoes, polyester rubber, mostly shoes, right? Shoes, sneakers are a commodity. Anybody can make them. You can get them for a few dollars a pair if you wanted, right? But they're able to charge $120, $150, $200 because it's not just a commodity, because every one of those shoes is a vessel for the values that Nike stands for, right? And if you can sell values and sell a story and an identity, something that I want to pull into my life because it expresses something about me better than, well, that commodity pair of shoes over there, then you can get people to pay a lot more and really engage with what you're doing. Right?
Yeah, and that's a powerful framework. And so when you think about, for Buffy, when you guys were day 1, day 10, day 100, in the early days, what were those values that you were anchoring on? Because I watched a bunch of your interviews leading up to this, and you seem like one of the premier thinkers around brand building. And I think that answer you just gave is a testament to it. You deconstruct the power of values and vision and mission and then build it back up. So for you in the Buffy story, what were the vision and values you were going towards, and how has that evolved over time?
Thank you. That was like the nicest thing anyone has ever had said to me, by the way. I don't know if I see it on that level, but it's I think a lot of it is actually sticking to the basics. I try to make things as simple as possible, I think. And when we started Buffy, we were like, hey, look, we have a comforter, right? Like, let's not try to talk to people like we're trying to introduce them to like a diamond ring from the moon or something, right? It's a comforter, right? And I think I spent a lot of time in particular interviewing a whole bunch of different demographics. This is very like just basic kind of business approach or consulting approach of like studying your customer, right? And I think, again, in the spirit of succinctness, simplicity, and clarity, I think I came down to like 10 different factors, like temperature regulation, like is it a natural material, so on and so forth. And then you have to challenge yourself to whittle that down to 3 things. which is very hard to cut down 7 things that you think might sell this product that you're actually really excited about selling, right? It's like, oh, I don't want to cut those things out of the story. They're a really big part of it, but you have to fight that instinct, right? You get it down to 3 things, and then you're like, even 3 things is a lot for the average person to take away. Now I have to pick 1 and stack it on top. And then what goes second in priority if people have more time, and then third, right? And I don't know how often, it was basically a Rubik cube in my head that I just played with the permutations of how we order those kind of key messages. And ultimately, when we started, it was the simplest one. It started with, this is the most comfortable thing you will ever find on earth. It is extremely easy to purchase it and shop for it. We gave people a free trial, right? And this is substantially more sustainable than what you are currently purchasing and using. And that was the kind of order we presented it. And we spent a lot of time kind of just hashing that out.
Yeah. And I want to push on the sustainability piece, because for Buffy, all of your products are made almost exclusively with eucalyptus versus cotton, polyester, down, some of these other, materials that have persisted in the industry.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to break down, why is it better to use eucalyptus than some of those other materials for the consumer? And then, of course, break it down for the environment as well.
Yeah. I'm always like one question behind you. I'm sorry, but I realized I didn't answer your last question fully, which is how it's evolved, and it's tied into this. I think as we grew from more than just one product, what really tied everything together was the sustainability mission premise, right? That's what you could see written into every product and made every product different from what you would find outside of Buffy, right? I think before the solution to starting with the problem, the textiles industry in general is one of the biggest polluters on the planet. I think it's the 6th largest, if you include, obviously, clothing, home goods, other soft goods. We don't recognize, but the average t-shirt that you're wearing, or let's say a pair of jeans, that pair of jeans probably took about 5,000 gallons of water to grow the cotton that went into it, especially if it's a affordable kind of pair of jeans that you're purchasing at the typical place that the average American consumer would shop. A lot of that cotton is coming from somewhere like Pakistan or India, where irrigation methods are slightly less advanced or less precise than they are here. A ton of water is being used to manufacture that in a world, particularly a part of the world, that is extremely sensitive to water constraints. Water in the Himalaya kind of basin is almost a geopolitical issue, right? That people fight over. Just to give you an example of how important that is. So I think from a waste standpoint, from a resource utilization standpoint, textiles is a big old mess. And a lot of companies and brands are here to work on transforming that, right? Buffy is one of them. We choose eucalyptus because primarily it uses 1/10 of the water that your average cotton product is going to use to cultivate that material, right? It's also comfortable, it's durable, it's silky smooth and soft, it has a bit of a cooling hand feel, it's biodegradable, you don't have to worry about it harming the environment in any way. But since eucalyptus, we've also introduced products, other sheets, for example, made out of hemp. We have a linen bed sheet set that's made entirely out of hemp. It's extremely soft, and what's great about hemp is it actually uses less of the stored nutrition in for example, field where you're actually cultivating the crop. It's also lighter on water usage. It doesn't require as much pesticides or fertilizers in order for you to have a very bountiful harvest. It just grows very well. All of these small things kind of stack up. And then the last thing that we use a lot of is a recycled polyester. Polyester was largely, I think, popularized in the 50s and 60s. When we discovered it, we were like, wow, this is a miracle material. right? It's super cheap. It's super durable. You can make it out of oil. This is crazy, right? But we've come to realize that, relying on petroleum to make things that we wear is a little bit maybe backward, especially things that we sleep in, right? And I think that combined with the fact that there is, I think, estimated to be the same weight of plastic in the oceans as there is fish by 2050, we're living in a world where polyester and other sort of petroleum derivatives, such as plastic, are becoming more and more of a threat to us, right? And so instead of using new polyester to make bedding or textiles, which is literally done every day, it's 99% of what people are buying, right? We are able to use the same that has already been made before and recycle it so that it is actually given a second life and a comfortable comforter or pillow or whatever you're purchasing.
Yeah. And how do you guys think about, continuous innovation and R&D at the company? Because I think what's fascinating as you dive into different companies is some will have, almost like a sprint of innovation initially to come up with their revolutionary product, and then they'll ride that for a while. Others have this DNA where innovation is infused, and they almost have a group with material scientists and product engineers dedicated to consistently trying to push the boundaries of what's possible. Which camp do you guys fall under, and how do you think about that as a leader of the company?
I think we are almost at the point where I have enough resource to invest in a real team and, for example, a VP of sustainability with a material science and consumer goods background. But to date, we have utilized a network of friends and consultants. For example, my family has been in this industry for some 30 years. We have a pretty large network of manufacturers, all the way at the raw material stages of things. And so we know a lot of people doing interesting things with different materials. And that has been the source of a lot of what we have, I think, incrementally brought to the industry, right? So, for example, we are, I don't know if I'm even allowed to go into this, but we're introducing a pillow later this year that's a more sustainability and technology driven pillow, a little on the more higher end of the price point. And we're looking at different materials. And one material that I'm very excited about, we're not necessarily committed to it yet, but is something called TPE. It's essentially a synthetic rubber, but the great thing about it is it can be made from a recycled rubber, but it can also be recyclable and is just fully biodegradable if you fail to recycle it, which is an amazing alternative, I think, to a lot of the kind of more firmer and supportive materials that are in bedding, whether pillows or mattresses or cushions, etc. Right? We want to keep innovating, and I think we've been scrappy about it, is the short answer. I think maybe one thing that's helpful is if you go on the Buffy website, you can read more about this, but on our mission page, we make long-term commitments. Long-term commitments to ideas like being fully closed loop or circular, for example, right? That means that everything we make basically doesn't either spin off a ton of waste or requires a lot of resource extraction to create it, right? This is a long-term goal, but for a company and a brand to kind of commit to that, it basically, I think, holds them more accountable and commits them to doing things like constant innovation. Another thing that we're going to make more transparent to the customer later this year is we have started to basically measure the environmental impact product by product, manufacturer supply chain, stage by stage of everything you buy at Buffy. And you'll literally be able to see it in like a pie chart compared to a standard product that you'd be buying from like Bed Bath & Beyond, for example, right? And this kind of like quantitative rigor and transparency is something that our CMO is very, I think, much leading and very much believes in. I think it's just, at the end of the day, is something that, again, helps the consumer understand exactly what they're biting into, and again, holds us accountable to innovating more if we want to lead in terms of sustainability.
Yes, sorry to cut you off. Yeah, what I was going to say is, so that was the product roadmap was a question that I wanted to get to, because as I consumed your content and material and dove into the website, it feels like Buffy is building more of a lifestyle or like an operating system for living, especially for interacting with home goods versus just a suite of products. And so to me, what's fascinating is, and I know focus as an entrepreneur is the most important thing, but home goods is a very broad category, right? And bedding is just one piece of that. And so as you're trying to take this angle of infusing a more wholesome way of living, sustainably driven, there's a lot of ways you could take that just outside of bedding. And so have you started to think about that, or does it just require 100% focus at this point to try to tackle the bedding space, and then you'll get that later?
No, I think about it all the time, and I think I have the luxury of doing so because the company and the team and everybody at Buffy do such a good job of focusing on the day-to-day and marshaling everything we need to deliver on time and executing it well. I think we are very set on becoming a destination for soft home, so soft goods throughout the home, whether it be bedding, carpets, towels, cushions, throw blankets, etc. We think that is just kind of almost our like birthright in terms of what we've set out to do and what we believe is achievable, right? With the materials pipeline, innovation pipeline, and the product pipeline, that's kind of what we have our sights set on. I think the bigger call, though, the bigger purpose is, imagine if IKEA, for example, made a commitment to making everything that it sells either out of a recyclable or a biodegradable material, right? Either it's a natural material coming in, therefore healthy and sustainable, you can regrow it, or it's something that was already recycled. And on the other end, it doesn't sit in a landfill for decades and decades and decades. It can just biodegrade and not harm the planet. If IKEA were able to make that promise and over the next 5-10 years turn everything in its halls into that kind of thing, I think that brand would go through a renaissance and a cultural relevance that it has not experienced in a very long time. IKEA is amazing in many other ways. It's also very challenging in many other ways as a brand, but just to kind of describe, I think, the potential of, I don't think Buffy is the only company that has its eyes or its sights set on offering the customer that end-to-end sustainable home solution, right? But I think it's an exciting vision that many of us are probably going to work toward, and hopefully together we can create.
Yeah, totally. One of the questions that people seem to love, which is kind of frustrating, is talking about what hasn't worked. And so when you think about, growing a company is very difficult. You have a few unfair advantages that we've talked about already, but, building a brand from scratch is almost impossible. And so you've definitely faced, I'm sure, tons of challenges and different things that you've tried or experimented with that just haven't worked. And you, of course, move on over those roadblocks. Can you share any that come to mind of kind of bets you've taken or things you've tried that haven't worked?
Oh, absolutely. Buffy, I think, is the site of one of the greatest kind of successes I've had in my career, but also 100% the site of my most abysmal failure. We launched in December of 2017, so we've been around for about a little over 3 years, right? And the growth in our first year was just extraordinary. I had estimated that we would maybe do something between, let's call it $3 to $5 million of sales, of gross top line sales. We ended up doing about $15 million, and the kind of expectations upon us, my own expectations, the co-founders' expectations, mushroomed proportionally, right? In the second year, we continued to grow at blitzkrieg pace, but what that meant was I was essentially pushing, building out an organization of people that went from 5 to 10 to 15 to 30 to 60 extremely, extremely quickly. It takes time for many reasons for 60 people to be organized and congeal into effective teams that actually can deliver against the organizational premises for why you built those teams. That time was not necessary. So we kind of ran at it, and we came to a point where I had, as a CEO, set pace for the company in such an unsustainable way that we were losing money, we were not profitable, and I had to let go of a significant portion of our employee base. And that was probably the most difficult day, week, months of my life. I had to almost kind of step away from the organization for a second because it was so draining and painful. And I think I felt so guilty, to be honest, and to be frank, and didn't really know who to speak about it with or how to process it, but it was extremely challenging and difficult and took a huge knock off my sense of self or ego or identity or confidence. And I think that was something that was probably the most challenging time of the experience. It was really the kind of dip in the roller coaster.
Yeah. It's an incredible story. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think, the founder's dream in theory is just exponential growth that they can't control. But to your point, that is brutal to have to scale a team, before the infrastructure can support it, and then have to take a step back off that. I think that's a good segue to a question that I love to ask founders, kind of on the flip side of that, which is around hiring. So I think, and I'm sure you'd agree, that hiring is one of, if not the most important things you can do. If you get the right people in the right roles at the right time, they can pretty much drive the ship. And that's where you see those kind of exponential gains. One of the things I like diving into with founders is not necessarily what qualities you look for when you hire, but how you personally run your process to find the superstars that you've already found. What would you say to that?
On hiring, I think it's one thing to try and find superstars. I think I don't necessarily have any magic tricks for that. I think a lot of it's just hustling, right? You getting out there. Nobody responds as well as they will to the founder, right? Reaching out to them and trying to find time with them. There are some other things around process and creating just a really big funnel, obviously, and getting, if you have the resources, creating leverage by maybe finding a very go-getting or hustling intern who can just create lists and do the outreach, right? And I'm happy to talk about that more, but I think the biggest lesson that I learned in terms of hiring actually is you have to trust your instinct. You have to trust your instinct about people. And I don't mean as simple as like, oh, I didn't have a good feeling about that person and it turns out they weren't good for us. I don't mean that per se, as much as I found that, look, if you're going to start a consumer brand, there are people from all kinds of different cultures that you're going to need to bring together to make this thing work. There are going to be quant-heavy folks who are doing, your website and digital product analysis. Their culture, their language, their mannerisms are totally different from the creatives that you hired, from a creative agency. Then there's, some of your ops people who have, let's say, management consulting backgrounds and so on and so forth. They're very different. Your ability to bring these people together and to communicate with all of them lead all of them is something that you cannot take for granted, that you'll have to work really hard on, and that you'll need to be honest with yourself in terms of capability. I think at first I just assumed that, hey, like I've been able to connect with and build rapport with and communicate with almost everyone I've ever had to work, right? But that doesn't mean I was ready necessarily to lead such different people from such different backgrounds and help them communicate with one another, not even necessarily myself, right? If you are unable to create those cultural communications lanes and bridges, there's a cost to that. There's a cost to that in terms of productivity. There's a cost to that because of let's call it a tax in the form of a lack of trust, because people don't understand each other's motives and values as well as they could. So when I say instincts, I mean like really think about, is this person that I'm hiring someone who understands me, who's going to understand the other people who are in this room right now, who is therefore going to be plug and play, bolt on, and start creating value and doing what they're here to do in a simple and straightforward way. If I could go back, I would never have created such a complex organization with so much organizational ambition. I would have kept it significantly simpler in terms of just the org tree and how it worked, as well as culturally who it is and why it is we're right. I think I would have saved not only myself but a lot of other people, which is what you come to learn more about. A lot of trouble and headaches and difficulties. And I almost tried less to be so here to unite everyone.
Yeah, that simplicity, it seems like a common theme across the entire org, right? How you communicate, how you build a brand, how you build the organization, the product roadmap. Simplicity seems to be the key. All right, so one last question, then we'll shift into some of the other questions around like your personal learnings and growth, even though you've infused a lot of those already, which is great.
Yeah.
And that's called the Startup Manifesto. So we ask this to every single guest, and it's basically, if you had to write a startup manifesto with 5 of the most important key lessons or pitfalls to avoid when starting out building a company, what would they be?
Number one would be like, make sure you, whatever business or industry or product you're in, like have a material advantage, a physical advantage of some sort. Don't come in here and take the same thing that people have already been making and try to just describe it differently. Really challenge yourself to say, hey, I have a true competitive advantage, as we were discussing earlier, in this space, and that's what I'm going to build upon. You might be the most intelligent person on earth, the most ambitious and diligent person on earth, but it is really good to have that in your back pocket to fall back upon at the end of the day. I think number 2, don't study and overthink a lot. But what you need to do is, like, you need to go out and test this thing immediately. I recommend that everyone, and this might be outdated, I might be dating myself, but I recommend everyone who talks to me about entrepreneurship read Steve Blank, his book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany. It is probably like the most simple, straightforward, broken down manual for how to discern whether this is going to work. And basically, he draws a contrast between the old model, which was called product development. A bunch of MBAs come up with what they think is a great idea, raise a bunch of money, and throw it out in the world, and either flops or maybe it does okay or whatever. But who knows? Wow. I don't want to start a business with that much uncertainty. He draws a contrast between product development and customer development, which is focusing less on, okay, what are we going to sell, but what do people want? Where are they now? Who are they? And what would they pay for already, right? So an example of that when we started Buffy was, before I started Buffy, I mean, there's almost like a live in fear. I invite you to live in fear of failure, because I didn't know if anything would be successful or work. So I took the smallest steps forward. And really, before Buffy, to give you an example of this, I started a brand called Charm with like a Squarespace website that I made like an afternoon with like some sample comforters that I had created, or actually 10 different versions that we were just like shipping out of literally a storage space, like one of those that you can rent monthly, where like we have like boxes and wrapping paper and like shipping tape, and like I did that for 3 months, just selling like a few $100s of comforters a week, just to like figure out, do I even have a business here? When I run ads to drive, traffic to my website here, is it like good ROI? Does it even make sense? Are my unit economics straight? Like, will this even work? Right? And like that was a really low risk, lower cost, substantially lower cost way of like, again, discerning will this work, right? And I learned a lot about what do I actually have to say, what do people actually need to hear to understand what I'm trying to say, right? So that's number two. It's like have a material competitive advantage. Second is like customer development, and like just test it before like you slam your foot on the gas, right? The third one, I guess, this is, I think, very specific to my business, but if you're going to start a consumer brand, I think there are like a few different models, but I feel like one contrast you can create is like, I feel like there's like the Caspers of the world and like the Patagonia, right? The difference that I'm trying to draw there, and there's so many that you can read into, but the difference that I'm trying to point out is like, I think Casper was like, there was a market opportunity. Some consultants got together, they saw a market opportunity, and they were like, let's just slam dynamite into this crevice, get as much leverage as we can, and blow up this market opportunity, right? That's very different from a brand, right? Which I think is built over time in terms of its currency being trust, identities, and stories and experiences that necessarily need to accumulate in real human beings that ultimately drive the highest ROI forms of growth and the highest margin forms of profitability. That is the only true lightning bottle when it comes to consumer. Right? When it comes to consumer packaged goods, there is no form of lightning in the bottle except for a truly organic built brand. Right? I think there are some companies in the middle, etc., but I'm just trying to tease out a difference. I think if you're going to do something in the consumer space, which I feel more comfortable speaking to, decide what your values are and really try to commit to using your brand to bring those to life. You're not going to win by like just exploiting some market opportunity. I would say, just to maybe like synthesize what we were talking about earlier, there's a leaner way to do whatever you're doing, a simpler way to do whatever you're doing, and a scrappier way to do everything you're doing. Trust that if it works that way, then it probably should be done that way. Trust that you don't need to like build out a full team to like capture all of these roles and responsibilities if these two people are handling and delivering and getting something done, for example, right? I think a lot of entrepreneurs, CEOs, and founders can be so focused on growth. They believe that we need to have so many products, so many places where we show up, and so many teams. We need to stand all this up, and we need to put so much money toward doing all of it. And they're not wrong, right? But until you've like gone through that and actually measured each of those things out for yourself in your own experience, I encourage you to err on the side of less is more. As I've, I think, learned myself and shared some failures today around why I feel that way. I think lastly, know what kind of entrepreneur you are. I think I would have loved to, I'm still I think of myself, maybe young isn't the right word, but immature in many ways as a entrepreneur or a leader or manager, etc. Right? There's a lot of experiences that I'm only having now. And again, I think one of the great things about Buffy was that it taught me how much I don't know and how much, the sliver of things I'm good at and the huge wedge of things that other people are really good at, better at me at, right? I know you hear that all the time, but it takes a great slap in the face to really let that sink in, right? Um, One example of that, I think, is for me, if I were to go back, again, like talking about culture, I think I would have been, I think I would have been a great leader and manager if the entire room were made out of quantitative management consultant types. That's what I know. That's the home I came from. That's the culture that I felt was the norm, right? But it wasn't for a lot of other people, right? And I think their experience at Buffy could have been better if I had more experience working within their cultures, right? And I do wish so much for everyone to have a great time working where they work because it's where you spend an incredible amount of your day. I think my instinct now would say like, hey, you know who you're good at working with, you know who you're good at directing and leading, try to stick with that, right? And try to use that advantage, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. I think what's amazing about this. So first of all, thank you so much for that list. What's amazing about a lot of those is it's really taking the ego out of it, right? When you put up the Squarespace site for 3 months, I'm sure of course, you had huge grand ambitions, but you were willing to take the ego out of it, take a step back, and then take that incremental step. It's the same thing when you think about Patagonia versus Casper. Patagonia in the early days were saying, all right, we're going to make a multi-decade commitment to really building an everlasting brand. That requires a lot less ego, right? You have to take your licks in the beginning. And so I think I love the way you articulated that.
before, actually, just to build on that, before we even made that website, the incrementally smaller thing we did was one of my co-founders, Shoaib, and I, who is our COO and president now, he and I would stand at the mall with literally a fold-up plastic table, 2 banners we printed out that said like 50% off sale comforters, with different comforters that like we bought some racks at like Marshalls and hung up just to like get people to react and see what we could learn. And if you're like not willing to do that, then you're going to leave out a lot of clarity and like understanding. I think, I mean, shows someone who left McKinsey probably could have made a few $100,000 a year. For him to go and do that all day to day on weekends is like definitely taking the ego out of it, right? And I think one great thing about the entrepreneurship journey is that it will take the ego out.
Yeah, totally. So, shifting to some of these other questions, one of the ones I wanted to touch on with you is this idea of the nomadic lifestyle has, of course, because of COVID accelerated, but become very popular. And when I think about the home and all the comforts that I've tried to spend years building and thousands of dollars infusing, as soon as you travel, you lose all of that anchor to what you've built. And so I'm curious how you guys think about it because you're trying to create the softest, most comfortable home goods in the world. Are you thinking about products that are suited almost specifically for kind of a more nomadic lifestyle that someone could take to Airbnbs, things like that? Have you thought about that at all?
I haven't personally thought about that, but I'm pretty sure the product team has thought about that. I think the use of or the development of some of our throw blankets and travel pillows is a step in that direction. That said, stepping back, I don't think we have like a major thesis in that direction, but I like the thought of that, and that's interesting. What could you picture? What were you thinking? Like carrying
Yeah, so
under, like what?
yeah,
Portable?
so that's a good question. I haven't thought a ton about it either. What I have thought is there's a ton of white space there, right? Not all, but most of the home goods companies that come to mind, Buffy being one, are all engineering for this idea of like a fixed home or a set home. So when I think about when I travel, what are the biggest pain points for me? Planes, like long flights, are a huge pain point. If you're staying in like a top tier hotel, Westin, or the things, I'm also a management consultant. So the things that we used to enjoy when we were traveling for management consulting, you're going to get the top of the top luxury. And so those hotel nights will be fine. But if you're staying in an Airbnb, it's a real toss up whether that person has invested in a solid mattress, solid comforter, sheets, blanket, pillow. So I think there's a couple of different verticals to investigate. One is the on the go. So literally when I'm in motion, what do I need to be more comfortable? And then the other is once I get to a temporary destination that I am not familiar with, that isn't a hotel, what do I do? And so I think there's a lot of interesting things
Wow,
there.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's really good outside the box thinking. I haven't actually turned my mind toward that, but I'm dreaming of something like I don't know, I've done a lot of like outdoors, hiking, climbing stuff. You know how under your sleeping bag you usually have a pad, right? There's the inflatable ones that you can blow into, or just like fold up ones, like foil, right? What if there was something as portable as that, but that could ensure that your bed, no matter where you went, was comfy and soft and felt fluffy and felt like the one at home, right? It would basically be a sort of portable mattress topper product that were designed and engineered to be so compact that you would feel, hey, this isn't a bad idea to just toss it in the bag or tie it to the backpack and walk out the door. I really like I really like the inspiration stimulus. Yeah, is that kind
Yeah,
of what you're thinking about?
yeah. So that is really interesting. And I didn't have like a fixed, mental picture of one specific thing. I just think the category as a whole is completely untouched. Another thought I had, just as we're talking is, what's interesting is like when you travel, you bring your bag, like you bring a backpack or a suitcase or whatever. You get there, you unpack the bag, and then you use those contents, whatever, clothes, shoes. But the bag is often left just on the side. What if you took your backpack and somehow created a way for the backpack itself to become what you're talking about, to become that comfortable layer? Then you wouldn't have to append something separate or carry something separate, which, when hiking and climbing, everything extra is so important. What if
Right.
you could actually turn the backpack somehow into that? There's like I said, a lot of interesting things to
Mm.
think through there. And if you guys invent a product and you name it the Kallaway, I'll know I'll know where it came from.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, I think we should all dream more about that. I haven't actually thought about it, but you're right. The mobility of home is pretty limited.
Yeah, because that's the biggest constraint, right? When I, at least when I'm traveling, I'm an avid traveler. I love, especially international travel. I love exploring new places. But I'm finding that like subconsciously, I dread the to and from because it's so disruptive to the normalcy or like the homeostasis that I've built with staying at home for multiple weeks at a time. It's so disruptive, and it often takes me weeks upon returning to get back to those even levels. So I think there's a lot of people out there that would pay so much to be able to replicate that comfort on the road in some ways. So definitely have the team think more about that. I think there's definitely some opportunity there
It would be a very, I think, just valuable promise if you could create something that lived up to that.
for sure. So a couple of these other questions for you. Um, like I mentioned at the beginning, you've had such a unique background, and I think it shows how balanced you are, right? As a speechwriter, language and communication is so critical. And then as a consultant, those things are important as well, but you also need that quantitative rigor to be able to perform analyses and competitive due diligence. And so I think you had a nice balance. But if you were to think back, what are some things, if any, that you wish you spent more time on when you were younger? Just knowing now what you wish you had to be successful.
Again, I feel like I would have loved to have spent a few years as an assistant to a CEO. or COO of a large organization where a significant, if not the brunt of their role, were organization and people related, right? At the end of the day, it's like, if you're a founder and you hope to lead this company as it grows and matures, you'll pick up a lot of it on the way. But if you're forced to kind of exercise that sooner than you're ready to, then what a challenging limiter for not only yourself but everyone around you who you're trying to make happy, who you're working day and night to try and make happy, right? These are incredible people that you've hired here. They're working super hard for you. They care about the mission of the brand. They've gone through successes and challenges, the ups and downs of being at a startup with you. You basically owe everything to these people. You see them every day. You joke with them at lunch. I cannot emphasize how beholden you feel to the people at your company when I think you get into a leadership position. And I think, therefore, I continue to feel so inadequate and maybe underprepared in my just management capabilities, even though I had some experience as a management consultant. I've seen it here and there. It's just, I think, another thing. I think I would have loved to have invested more time to had I had the choice.
Yeah. And that's probably why we're seeing this chief of staff role, I think, become so popular. Like everywhere I look at these high growth companies, there's a chief of staff I'll engage with when I interview the founder afterwards. And then I'll look at their background and they're incredibly accomplished, right? These are not, some people may assume they're almost like assistant level. That's not what this is. These are really, really capable people that are basically entrepreneurs in training.
Yeah.
And they're doing kind of a fellowship essentially.
Yeah. When I said assistant, it was because I wouldn't dare say chief of staff, or I didn't dare to say chief of staff because it's a lot.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, 2 questions left for you, and then we'll get you out of here. So the first one is around wellness. I personally, this is an area that I'm super, super passionate about, this idea of the wellness stack. And so the way I think of it is, nutrition, sleep, fitness, meditation, the content you consume, all of that kind of layers on top of each other and has compounding effects when aligned properly. I'm curious, in your life, how do you think about wellness, and do you have any, practices or routines across any of those verticals?
I definitely shot my body to hell when I was at McKinsey, just working really hard. And I stopped being able to really sleep, I think because I wasn't going to bed until midnight. And then by 4 a.m., 5 a.m., I started to dream about the presentations I would have to give the next day. By 6 or 7, I would just give up and start practicing them and wake up and get up and do it. And I think sleep is the biggest, most foundational thing to me. I do not compromise on sleep for anything. I will show up late. I will push things back. I don't really care what time it is. I will protect my sleep. And protecting your sleep is often related to many other things. Are you managing your stress? Are you eating well? Are you exercising? Are your relationships in a good place? I think everything's kind of connected, but sleep is number one for me. I think the second one for me is I have learned that actually digestive health is a cut of all of this that is really important and also fundamental to me. It's a reflection of, I think, so much of the activity in your body. Think about how much of your organs and your just core is dedicated to digestion. But I think if you're eating well and exercising well and digesting well, you tend to have higher energy, to be more focused, to sleep better, to be better able to manage stress, etc. I think digestion is really important too. I work out every day, sometimes twice a day. That's just always kind of been the case. I feel like I have a lot of physical energy, maybe less mental energy, but a lot of physical energy. So I try to get it out, and it always makes me feel good. I try to eat very healthy too. But yeah, I don't have any hard rules. I think at the end of the day, I think like people know themselves best, and like this is a tricky one. It's like I don't think I learned how to appreciate it until I failed at it. And maybe that's just how I live my life now that I'm reflecting on this conversation and the movies going across. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm very similar to you. It seems like you've got your health pretty well dialed in, and I think people who do have many or all of those areas pretty well honed seem to be very level, right? Very even keel. They're able to adapt and make decisions with level heads. People who don't sleep, don't eat right, maybe their digestive health is off. They tend to be more sporadic, at least what I've noticed. All right, so last question for you is just around any emerging trends. So I know we kind of hit the brainstorm a little bit earlier with kind of the comfort mobility, but are there any other areas outside of home goods or bedding that you've come across in the last 6 to 12 months that are just really compelling to look out for in the next few years?
I feel like it's really hard right now for me to identify anything that I think is going to be like really big and transformative. I feel like we're at this moment where so many of the disruptive technologies or platforms or just ways of doing things have kind of come to fruition, right? And a lot of, for example, like e-commerce is really starting to mature, and then D2C is really starting to mature, and storytelling is starting to mature, etc. It's really hard to find like what that next thing is. I honestly haven't really. If I were to combine it with that question you had around like a different business, I am looking right now at what I think is a major opportunity in, and this is just very early an initial study, but fashion is something that, as someone in consumer goods, I just interact with and think about a lot, see a lot, and digest a lot of. Fashion is very interesting because look at what you're wearing and what I'm wearing, and I think like they express very different things about us, right? Like what you're wearing, it's comfortable, that's important to you, like, but it's also like kind of friendly and maybe kind of hip. You can meet someone on the street and notice that what they're doing in terms of their fashion is totally different from you, and that's important to them and important to you because you get to express yourself. Now, chances are that you and that same person, if you and I go into each other's homes, what we have in terms of furniture might not be all that different. I might bump into like the most interesting, fashionable person on earth, right? Maybe they're even a fashion influencer on Instagram, but chances are what they have in their home is also like you. It's funny that at home, we are in this place that's supposed to be most us, right? And most like comfortable being ourselves. We have the least to use to express ourselves, right? If you want to find very expressive furniture or objects of art or decorative items, you either have to like spend hours hunting for this stuff, like in secondhand markets or trolling through like the internet, or like you're dropping thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on it, right? I think there is an opportunity for a business to come around and create furniture that isn't just practical, right? But also really helps us express ourselves and make our homes feel like home, right? Self-expression and identities are probably one of the most important things to us as humans. That's why they are so valuable as businesses commercially. Think about Instagram, the ability to curate your identity, right, is so valuable. And I think the fact that that hasn't really been unlocked fully, like completely made easy at home, I think is a huge opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, there's to build off that, I think there's probably more, but there's two interesting things that popped into my head with that. One is, an approach a company could come along and make furniture more modular in a way where it's a lot more customizable, but still, it doesn't solve exactly what you're saying because it's still, a derivation of the same structure. So that's interesting. And that maybe is like a baby step into what you're saying, because I totally agree that it's interesting how people spend so much time and effort trying to create a unique persona for themselves. But you're right, in the house, they don't. One thing that I wanted to share is I talked to the founder of Burrow Couches a few episodes ago,
Yeah.
and he was actually, yeah, Steven, he's awesome. And we were talking about this idea of drops where like today Burrow may have 10 SKUs and they make, thousands of each and they sell them in a few different colorways, but effectively it's the same product. But what happens when these furniture companies or these product companies can all of a sudden collab with artists, and artists can release unique pieces, maybe not one of ones, but limited edition drops that provide a lot more breadth in the different types of designs and colors and fashion that you can infuse in furniture. And I thought that was fascinating. And they're exploring that now, but it's still super early.
I think that's fascinating. And I think I spoke to him a few weeks ago, and he mentioned this, and I think somebody needs to be investigating that, bringing that to life. How fun would that be, right? Um, I think even before like modularity or like custom design ones, or I guess it's in the same realm. I'm just talking about like a furniture company that has the guts and maybe like, dare I say, the balls to like make designs that are anywhere in the spectrum of just like mundane to what I would call like blasphemous, right? Really weird stuff out there, strange things. I think a lot of it's like, if you can do that, and then on the bottom in the denominator, have the kind of cost and production advantages of an IKEA, if you can crack that, if you can have both of those things, and therefore have freedom of expression at mass affordability, you would have this beast of a new company in the furniture and home space that I don't think people have seen before. I mean, it's basically like if IKEA made like stuff that wasn't just kind of like meant to fit in everywhere, right? As
Like crazy, unique, yeah, wild patterns and designs and things. Yeah, it's fascinating. That's amazing. So I want to be mindful of your time. Before I let you go, I just want to acknowledge you for a second. As I'm obviously hosting the show, and I hope that all the listeners that will listen to this over the next few months and years really got a lot out of it. For me, I'm sitting here listening, and personally, I'm taking away so much. I think what popped out about you that's so inspiring is just how articulate and thoughtful you are around the way you approach your strategic thinking, but also it seems like everything in your life is very calculated, very thoughtful. And that approach is a breath of fresh air. I think when I talk to some of these founders and they're all over the place, you're very dialed in. And so, if people listen to this and they take nothing else away, I think that brand ethos that you represent is super powerful. So I just want to thank you again for coming on, and I'm going to continue to be a huge fan and support Buffy as much as possible.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a real fun time being here. These were some tough questions, and I feel like I tried to be as vulnerable and as honest as possible, and hopefully that was helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. Leo Wang, founder and CEO of Buffy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.